This house is ready to be sold. I'm prepared to start over. We can pick from 50 different states. In search of the truth, we sacrificed all. Jonathan Lamb had spent years silently following in his father's footsteps. Everything is buzzing about his shocking interview in which he discusses the billion-dollar-day business for the first time. Did it pass down beliefs or authority? Little did anyone anticipate the darkness, depth, and complexity of the truth that lies behind the cameras. Money isn't the only factor here. An entangled sun torn between truth and loyalty, as well as control and legacy, are major themes. Everyone was expecting Jonathan Lamb to become king. The Dyer television network's founder, Marcus Lamb, his father, had already pledged it in writing. It appeared to be finalized on the surface. A worldwide Christian empire had been built by Marcus over many decades. Throughout that time, Jonathan had never left his side. Being the son wasn't all he was. He was the selected one, the logical continuation of the line, and the next in line. For a time, it appeared as though it was indeed going to transpire. Following Marcus's passing in 2021, Jonathan was formally appointed as vice head of state. The man got up on camera. He assumed additional duties related to leadership. For the first time ever, he and his wife Susie witnessed a substantial increase in their income. For the first time in their lives, they felt financially stable. For a short while there, it seemed like a seamless transfer was in the cards. In his father's absence, the son would step in. The dream would go on. The vow in writing was quietly broken, so the empire would stay in the family. However, that chapter was never completely opened. Things were changing behind closed doors. Decisions were being taken by the leadership team without consulting Jonathan. He was not invited to any of the meetings that were taking place. The assurances that were formerly so strong began to waver. The dire energy shifted. The focus shifted away from handing the torch. It was all about changing the course of the race completely. Worse, however, Jonathan and Susie weren't merely let go from their jobs. Their entire future, crafted over many years, was shattered. There was no desire to advance professionally. An intensely spiritual and personal experience. As a result of his years of the network, his entire life, his service had been marked by humility and devotion. All of a sudden, the plan that everyone had believed was set in stone started to look hazy. Not all of the story was conveyed to the spectators. Their perception was that Jonathan and Susie had amicably separated, as if it were a joint decision. However, that was not accurate. They persisted. Due to exhaustion, due to the unfulfilled promise of the promised path, they decided to walk away. They were past the reins of leadership that rightfully belonged to them. A legacy that had been previously apparent was quietly unraveling as there was no public drama or great fight, just a quiet exit. Unfortunately, the kingship for which Jonathan had been training for the better part of his life never materialized. There is, however, a lengthy storyline available. They're wealthy beyond belief. This ministry, worth millions of dollars, hires them. How has this impacted your finances? How has it affected your financial situation? My compensation as VP of JAR was really substantial. Just that 1 year, in 2023? Oh, wait, that was in 22. Was that when you received that large bump? Before that, we were always on par for 2023. The one destined to lead Dyer stepped down, not because he wasn't prepared, but because the door had been closed on him after a year of being full-time vice president in 2022. We were shocked that people wanted to treat us like we still had a mortgage and other bills to pay from our lavish lifestyle. The promised throne turned out to be an empty promise. And the result is not a sad conclusion but an exciting new chapter. A tale about standing up for what's true, even if it means giving up all you hold dear. It wasn't exhaustion, a lack of interest, or a lack of potential that caused Jonathan and Susie Lamb to abandon Dyer. Their departure was due to. They had to stop acting now. Furthermore, a hefty cost was associated with such choice. Their service had been unwavering for many years. Jonathan was more than a regular employee. The heir was him. Marcus Lamb had invested much in, mentored, and appointed to his position. The documentation was there. We laid the groundwork. Nearby members of the network were aware of the impending doom. In theory, Jonathan should have taken the head of state. Everything changed, though, once Marcus passed away. First, everything proceeded according to plan. In the role of vice president, Jonathan took over. A secure financial future was within reach for him and Susie. After what felt like an eternity, they finally felt at ease in their own home. It was a decent paycheck. A clear path appeared to lie ahead. It felt like the long-awaited season had finally arrived after all their hard work and sacrifice. However, there was an underlying issue. I could feel it, Susie. That was felt by Jonathan. A sense of spiritual discontent and anguish gripped their consciousness, refusing to be ignored. Certain individuals' discreet reappearance revealed the first cracks. Gathered together. People whose faces had hurt them. Things that were previously dismissed as idle chatter suddenly seemed perilously near to being true. Someone from the Lamb family was said to have hurt their daughter, according to one of those rumors. Even though the claims had been made before, no one had spoken out about them. Nothing changed, nothing was investigated, and no one was held accountable. Plus, Jonathan and Susie couldn't ignore that. Joni Lamb was also not slowing down. She put on the public persona of a distraught wife. However, swift and exact judgments were being taken behind closed doors. There was an abrupt resuscitation of projects that Marcus had put on hold. The positions of leadership were changing. Above all else, Joni's connection with Dr. surfaced was Doug Weiss. Advising wasn't all he was doing. Conversations about leadership were entering his path. He was being brought in as more than just an advisor. He was being brought in as a potential personal and professional partner. That was more than just awkward for Jonathan and Susie. I was shocked. All they were familiar with, concerning honesty, religion, and loved ones, was turned on its head. Jonathan thought they were supposed to keep the principles that Marcus had established the network on, but instead, someone else was subtly replacing them with something else, and they were told to be quiet, accept it, act as if nothing had changed. It would have been Jonathan's presidency if they had gone along with it and consented. They would still be there. Rich, safe, and well-respected. What price, though? His elevation as vice president gave me a boost in 22. Prior to that, when everything finally heated up, when we were in our early 20s after he passed away and I received a really wonderful salary and Jonathan did as well, you'd think it would be the moment to be enticed to stay, if anything, but we were already prepared. In other words, I begged God during the struggle and breaking of it all. How long till Jonathan is prepared? This house is ready to be sold. I'm prepared to start over. We can pick from 50 different states. In search of the truth, we sacrificed all. If only we had read the card, praised my mom's marriage, continued to not question anything about Pete, and went along with the charade, setting aside our convictions. It became crystal clear. To remain would be to give in. Turning a blind eye to matters that adversely affected their family would be the right thing to do. It would include letting the person who injured them roam freely throughout the premises. It would imply pretending like it didn't matter when Joni remarried Doug Weiss a few months after Marcus passed away. Above all else, it would entail giving up on their calling for the sake of convenience. $1 billion in assets, titles, luxury, and security were all stripped from them as they walked away. Plus, they accomplished it without causing a fuss, making any public declarations or blaming anybody. Truth was their only option. And that is when the true expense became apparent. The quiet became deafening as soon as they left. Trusted connections become distant. Beloved acquaintances vanished. It was more than simply a job, it was the loss of a community. They were questioned by many. They were even betrayed by some. The plot within Dyer was swiftly reworked. It has nothing to do with beliefs. The theme was defiance. It had nothing to do with morality. It everything has to do with ego. Yet, neither Jonathan nor Susie said a word. It wasn't that they lacked a tale to tell, it was that they had faith that God would reveal it at the right moment. In the background, they were wrestling with God, praying, and asking for guidance. They even admitted in the interview that there were times when they cried. They didn't feel remorse for their choice since. Sometimes it pains to do what's right. Honesty costs a lot of money. It robs you of companionship, chances, security, and ease. It was worth it, though, as Jonathan and Susie would attest. They began again, this time relying on faith rather than a solid strategy or substantial savings. It was time to go. They were prepared. They were prepared to follow God's lead and start over, regardless of the consequences, including the possibility of being forgotten. According to a framework, their path was directed by God. They discovered tranquilly in that humble act of giving in. They weren't anticipating the ovation. They were not seeking compliments. The ability to look their kid in the eyes while being certain that she was safe was their greatest desire. So they might rest well knowing they stood firm, trusting God no matter how lonely the path. They decided on that legacy. Jonathan and Susie's tale is far from over. They have broken their ties with the Dyer moniker and are stronger than ever in their own identity. The bravery to leave didn't merely reveal holes in the system. When put to the test, it showed what true faith looks like. Quiet, low volume. Furious, but calm, submissive, and steadfastly compliant. Simply said, there are occasions when reaching new heights does not yield the greatest rewards. They result from leaving even if all signs point to staying. At some point in their faith, every believer must prioritize their life's priorities. Confidence or ease. That time arrived stealthily in the background for Jonathan and Susie Lamb when the circumstances under which no one was observing. From the outside, it looked like they had it all. A high-ranking job in one of the greatest Christian networks in the world. Confidence in one's future, power, and safety. A revered figure in the Christian community. However, there was an underlying unease that would not go away. Following Marcus Lamb's death, it was believed that Jonathan would continue the tradition for viewers, employees, and the Christian community. It was clear. Who was he? The son. His service had been unwavering. His vision was clear. Jonathan was to follow in Marcus's footsteps, as he had explicitly stated in writing. We had that in mind. It was the assurance given. And temporarily, it looked like that was the way things were heading. In the position of vice president, Jonathan assumed leadership. Susie was given a pay increase. They were in the most advantageous financial position they had ever experienced. Finally, after years of barely getting by, of making do with little money and giving up a lot for ministry, they felt like they had arrived. At this point, most people can only fantasize about being where they are now. They were expecting to feel happy or relieved, but instead they were anxious. It all began with minor details. Changes in leadership, the introduction of new faces into closed-door meetings, and the progression of ideas and plans that lacked the foundational principles and spirit upon which Marcus had founded the ministry. Subsequently, the intimate, behind-the-scenes portion arose. There were lingering animosities within the family, accusations involving someone from the Lamb family who had a profound impact on the daughter of Jonathan and Suze. Nothing was done. Complete lack of responsibility, genuine dialogue, and only quiet. Put it behind you. Thereafter, Junie was remarried to Doug Weiss, a Christian counselor who caused Jonathan and Susie to question his motives and involvement in the ministry. Judgment was not the point. It was all about being discerning, about seeing their upbringing's ideals eroded in favor of damage control and image management. Silence would have been an option. It would have been easier for them to just keep quiet and go along with it. I would have been president if Jonathan had run. They would have had plenty of money. By now, their platform would be much larger. They may have reassured their daughter by stability. However, how much would it have cost them? A spiritual unease, a persistent nudging, is how Susie characterizes it. For financial gain, she was not praying. By no means was she praying for enlightenment. She prayed for a release, for the courage to leave if that was God's will. Like everyone else, Jonathan was struggling with more than simply the external circumstances. He is concerned about the implications of remaining. Could he face the reflection in the mirror knowing that he had compromised honesty for financial gain? Looking in the mirror, he finally accepted the fact that he had traded honesty for financial gain. If he had shielded his daughter from the individuals who harmed her, would he be able to look at her and say he had protected her? Beliefs held while times are good aren't the only ones that constitute faith. Concerning what? When the stakes are high, we make our decisions. That meant prioritizing faith over luck, truth over comfort, and conviction over position for Jonathan and Susie. They kept quiet about it. Neither a press conference nor a social media statement were issued. They abstained from a billion-dollar ministry, official titles, six-figure salaries, and the kind of security that most people strive for their entire lives because they knew, deep down, that staying would require giving something up. And we didn't have time for it. It was confusing to some. This is not the case for everyone. It appeared careless, passionate, and even stupid to those on the outside. What gives you the will to abandon the authority, the legacy, and the foundation your ancestors laid? However, they were unaware of all the details. They were oblivious to the restless. Throughout the night, the prayers, the sobs, and the talks that seemed like a spiritual battle, no one was chasing after Jonathan and Susie. The kind of tranquility that can only be achieved by doing what is asked of you, no matter the cost, was what they were chasing. They sold their home, gave up their possessions, and began anew relying only on their faith. Still, they claim to have never felt more liberated. Because money and position aren't the keys to freedom. Feeling secure means you haven't betrayed your essence. When you know deep down that it's the correct thing to do, you must learn to walk away. Staying, smiling on camera, nodding in meetings, and acting like everything was normal would have been easy, even if the world thought it was wrong. However, it did not define them. Nobody asked them to be a part of anything, but swore to live their lives honestly. Thus, everything was set aside. We laid everything on the altar for the truth. That's how seriously they took it, as Jonathan put it. They lost their positions, clout, and wealth because of the fact. However, their serenity was restored to them. It restored their sense of direction. Furthermore, and maybe most significantly, it restored their a voice that was once restrained and frightened may now speak its mind. We chose God over the game. Their story isn't dramatic, but their voice might express it all. It lacks resentment and vindictiveness. It exudes an air of poise and serenity. In order to make a point, they stayed put. They realized they had to walk away, so they did. As an example of the type of religion that isn't necessarily well received. This kind, though, alters the course of events completely. Do you regret it? Is a question that people continue to ask, and their responses remain consistent. Absolutely not. Reason being, their faith more than made up for their misfortune. They got tranquilly in exchange for the comfort they sacrificed. They rediscover the meaning and purpose that they had lost in empire. Being brave doesn't always need stepping foot on a stage, as our journey teaches us. It appears as though one is being stepped off. Holding on isn't always a sign of genuine faith. It appears to be releasing. Leaving it all behind can be the richest thing you do at times. What good is it to have the world at your fingertips if you let it consume you? Neither Jonathan nor Susie lost sight of one another. Even today, when most people think of legacy, they picture the kind of success that gets covered in magazines or honored with standing ovations. Jonathan Lamb was born into that. That is what his last name meant in the Christian world. Dyer was his family's empire, and for years, everyone assumed he would be the one to carry it forward. However, the real finder of their identity and their relationship with God was in the quiet, costly obedience of saying yes, Lord. But on occasion, departing from the limelight isn't how you leave a lasting impression. At other instances, it depends on what you're ready to let go of. Not because you were kicked out or because you didn't succeed, but because you prioritized something greater than that. You opted for harmony, sincerity, and self-assurance. The path appeared to be clear after Marcus Lamb's death in 2021. This was the moment for which Jonathan had been trained. That strategy for taking over was in writing. His appointment as vice president was announced by the ministry. A rise was given to his wife Susie. They hadn't felt financially secure in years, but at last it had arrived. A safe and powerful future seemed to be in the cards. Still, a subtle storm was gathering beneath it all. The documentation wasn't the issue. I didn't mean skills and experience. Even though Jonathan was prepared, the ministry's culture, principles, and spirit were undergoing rapid transformation. Something that used to feel holy now feels artificial. The topic of faith seems to have shifted to one of image management. Jonathan and Susie had all the preparation in the world, but as the truth started to come out, truths that affected their family deeply, they had to make a tough choice. They could have played it safe and remained quiet. The throne would have been theirs without a doubt if they had remained in line, smiled for the camera and said everything that was required of them. However, there was an issue. No longer was it only a network. The succession to the presidency was only one of the issues. Integrity, the question of whether or not they could still be able to see their reflection in the glass. The drama and suspense weren't the worst parts. There was a change in priorities, there was inaction when things needed a reaction, and no one was held responsible when actual harm was at stake. None of it could be disregarded. Staying would have made them complicit, Jonathan realized. Thus, they departed. Instead of holding a press conference or acting bitterly, try peacefully resisting. They remained amicable. They remained calm. They made no accusations. They just stood aside and remained silent. In pursuit of the still, small voice inside, they forsook wealth, status, and power. Faith triumphed over empire, and truth triumphed over appearance. Marcus left behind an enormous, influential, and esteemed legacy. However, Jonathan was not tasked with protecting it no matter what. Obedience was his calling, and he was to follow it even if it meant his father's empire would crumble. Doing it is not a simple task. It's not a dream job. This kind of obedience is seen by heaven, yet it does not come with praise or recognition. The sort that generates real legacy. As Susie wisely pointed out, consistency isn't necessarily the key to finding serenity. Surrender might be a place of finding it. Indeed, it is precisely what they learnt when they decided to part ways. Now they were at peace. Not the sort that eases anxiety, but the kind that brings about understanding. Feeling good about what you accomplished, regardless of the pain it caused, regardless of the consequences to your platform.